Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar about the new race variable on IPUMS USA, RACHSING, and the accompanying predicted value variables. Today, we will be covering what these variables are, why they are needed in research, and how to use them in your work. My name is Megan, and I work on the IPUMS USA project, and presenting with me today is Carolyn Liebler, who is an associate professor of sociology and an MPC faculty member at the University of Minnesota. Before we jump into the content for today's webinar, I first want to go over some Zoom logistics. So this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the IPUMS website following the webinar today. Real-time closed captions are being auto-generated, and you can turn these off or on by clicking the CC button in your Zoom controls. If you have questions about Zoom or any technical issues, you can send those questions directly to the host, which is IPUMS. And you can submit any content questions you have through the Q&A tool. Finally, we will be posting a written Q&A document following the webinar addressing the questions that you all ask today. So in today's webinar, we will start with a brief introduction of IPUMS USA. We'll talk about the background on race variables in IPUMS USA, what problem RACHSING is trying to solve, past solutions that have been created for this problem, some bad ideas, RACHSING, and then now RACHSING, how RACHSING was made, using RACHSING and the PRED variables, and then how to find these variables on the IPUMS USA website. But before we dive into discussing the RACHSING and predicted value variables, I wanted to first provide a quick overview of the IPUMS USA project so that everyone has the same level of understanding as we move through the presentation. I recognize that some of you are really familiar with IPUMS and the USA project, but I want to make sure that I'm catching those folks that are joining us and may not be as familiar with this data collection. So at a high level, IPUMS USA preserves and harmonizes US decennial census and American Community Survey microdata across both time and space, and provides easy access to this data with enhanced documentation through the IPUMS USA website. Our main goal at IPUMS is to do the work of applying consistent coding across sample years and different levels of geography so that our users do not have to individually do the work. So essentially, our goal is to save users time by doing this work once and providing it to everyone to access free of charge. So that's a brief overview of the explanation for what we do at IPUMS. And now I want to touch on what data products are available on IPUMS USA, starting with the data sets that we offer. So first, we offer US decennial censuses from 1790 through 2010. The 1790 through 1840 data are household and county level data sets. The 1850 through 1940 data are full count data sets, meaning that they include the entire US population for those years. And the 1950 through 2010 data are decennial census samples. But if anyone is keeping track, 2022 is the year that the 1950 full count census will be released to the public. So we all at IPUMS are very eager to start working on that to make that available to our users. We also offer American Community Survey data from 2000 through 2020. Keep an eye out for the 2025 year ACS sample to be released in the next month or so on the IPUMS USA website. And we also have other supplemental data sets and resources available on our website. So we highly encourage that you check those out. Included in the census and ACS data sets are many topics of interest, including different levels of geography, household composition, family interrelationships, income and poverty, industry and occupation, socioeconomic status, health insurance, and many, many more. So there's a few different ways that you can access IPUMS USA data. First, you can create a custom data extract through our website, which allows you to select the samples and variables of interest to you. You can also utilize the online analysis tools, which include the online analysis system and IPUMS Abacus. And our newest method for accessing the data is the IPUMS Microdata Extract API, which is currently in beta testing phase. So we are always looking for more users to help us with beta testing. So if using an API to access the IPUMS USA data is of interest to you, I would highly encourage you to email ipums+api@umn.edu and let them know that you're interested. And all of this data and documentation are freely available to everyone on our website, which is usa.ipums.org. So that was an extremely quick overview of the IPUMS USA project. I'm now going to pass it on to Carolyn to talk about RACHSING.
Hi, my name is Carolyn Liebler. Just want to make sure you can hear me.
We can, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I was responsible for making RACHSING and the PRED variables, and I also made RACHSING and previous variables. So that's why I'm sharing today. RACHSING and PRED variables are a simplified race ethnicity variable in two formats. So RACHSING and PRED variables are the same information in two different formats. And why would you want to use these? One major use of these variables would be for consistent denominators for rates. Because it's such a simplified measure, it works for situations where you have very different data collection efforts. Another reason you might use it is to show trends over time that begin before 2000, when the data changed dramatically. And another reason is that this only includes 5 categories. All of the categories are interpretable, and together they include all people. So this might be especially useful if you are going to use the online analysis tool or IPUMS Abacus, because it's a great summary of race and ethnicity. I would like to point out, though, that this is a very simplified measure, and the details are still available. You can still use the details in the race variable and the Hispanic variable to more deeply understand the answers that were given by the people that you're studying. So why do we even have race? Why do we have this issue? So in 1977, the federal government decided that we need some federally defined races for the purpose of dealing with new civil rights legislation. So the Office of Management and Budget, which is a division of the executive branch, decided that we would have 4 officially federally defined single race groups, and that every federal data resource needed to include, at a minimum, these 4 single race groups and 2 ethnicities. They decided that Hispanic is not a race, it's an ethnicity, Hispanic or Latino, and the 2 ethnicities are Hispanic and non-Hispanic. So you can see that they did not allow people to report multiple races in this federal definition. Then in 1997, they modernized it to make 2 major changes. One is that they separated out between Asian and Pacific Islander. Used to be the same group, now they're 2 separate groups. And also they allowed multiple races to be reported. And they mandated that all federal data collection efforts should allow people to report multiple races. Notice the emphasis on federal. So one of the problems that this created, so it's great that people can more accurately describe themselves, but one of the problems is that this was a federal mandate and states were not mandated to follow through. So states were slow to change from single race, and only recently have, so 25 years later, have developed systems that more consistently include the option to report multiple races. So states birth certificate data, death certificate data, cancer registries are collected by states. And someone who's creating rates like birth, death, or cancer rates have state data as the numerator and federal data as the denominator. So what do you do with the differences in the race measurement? Another major problem is that analysts are faced with 127 possible combinations of the federally defined race and Hispanic categories. If you also include this other category, so in the census, there are the 5 federally defined race categories, the 1 federally defined Hispanic or not Hispanic. And then there's also another race category that they call some other race. And that's just a leftover for anyone who doesn't fit in the federally defined races. Almost everyone who's in the some other race category also reports Hispanic, but there are some people who report non-Hispanic some other race, which is a problem that I'll talk about later. So anyway, that's 7 categories, and you could have a yes or no on all 7 of those. So that makes 2 to the 7th is 128 categories. And we're taking out the people who didn't respond to either the race or ethnicity questions. So now we have 127 categories. And that's just including the people, just saying like Asian, not saying which Asian group, just saying American Indian, not saying which American Indian group. So that is so many categories. It's really not helpful analytically. A common solution to this problem is to combine all 2 or more races. And this is, I put solution in quotes because I don't see this as a very good solution. It's an uninterpretable category. Who is this 2 or more races? That's combining, Black Asians with white American Indians. They probably have very different experiences. Another issue with this 2 or more races solution is that American Indians and Pacific Islanders, 2 of our smallest groups, a very large percentage of them report 2 or more races. And so if you're taking out all of the multiple race American Indians and Pacific Islanders, then you're just leaving a small and non-random subset of American Indians and Pacific Islanders in your single race category. So here's what that would look like. I just chose one of the variables in the American Community Survey, which is in IPUMS USA. And so this is people ages 30 and over in households who are living with their grandchildren. And I wanted to divide it up by race and ethnicity. And so if you're doing a cross tabulation of the race groups by Hispanic group, and you're doing it in the 2 or more races version, you've got 12 categories. This is a very difficult chart to really understand what's happening here. We've got the 2 or more races group that is uninterpretable. We've got Hispanic people divided across groups. Most of them are either going to be in the some other race Hispanic or the white Hispanic. And then the non-Hispanic some other race is a very small group. And we have this problem where American Indians, a good proportion of them are in the 2 or more races category. So I see this as the kind of chart that I would like to not happen anymore. Another solution that people have tried is to group all the multiple race responses in with all the single race responses. So that's what AOIC means. That's an abbreviation that the Census Bureau has been using, and they mean alone or in combination. So if someone reports Black and American Indian, then they're going to be in both the Black column and the American Indian column. And that means that all the American Indians are in the American Indian column, which solves one problem, but it makes a new problem, which is that the totals add to more than the total population. So it doesn't work for things like rates very well. So when, this change was made in 1997 in time for the 2000 census. And when the 2000 census was first coming out, the research community had some ideas of what to do with these 127 categories. How are we going to deal with this? Alone or in combination is not the best solution for most statistics. So two of these options, I'm going to say, they're a nice try, but in the end, they're not a good idea. So one idea would be to take all 2 race people and put give each of their race groups a half weight. So someone who's Black and Asian gets a weight of half into the Black category and half into the Asian category. Or you could just assign the whole case to the smallest race group, which means a Black Asian person would go into the Asian group. Both of these are for the convenience of the researcher and are not actually based on any kind of empirical reality. So that is the basic problem. And that's the solution that the National Center for Health Statistics researchers, what they brought to the table in a 2003 publication that many people have been using ever since, is that they were basing it on empirical reality. How do we divide up, how do we deal with multiple race responses in an empirically based way? So this team of researchers used the 1997 to 2000 National Health Interview Survey to create individual level prediction equations, predicting the single race that multiple race people would report if they were asked to provide a single race. And that was one of the questions in the National Health Interview Survey from 1997 all the way up until 2018. So they created these prediction equations, and they published this piece, and we've been using it. The research community has been using this ever since, either for whole allocation or partial allocation. I just want to briefly introduce what those terms mean, because I'm going to use them later as well. So the prediction equations that the National Center for Health Statistics team created so say you have an American Indian and white person, then the prediction equation would take characteristics of that person and characteristics of where they lived and give them a result of 0.35 American Indian, I'm just making this up, for one person, and 0.65 for white. So it's divided across the 2 groups that they reported, and it sums to 1. So you can think of this as maybe a likelihood. That's not technically what it is, but it is a reasonable way to think about it. So maybe a 65% chance that they would pick white, a 35% chance that they would pick American Indian. You can also think of it as kind of a weight. So whole allocation would take this information and say, okay, we're going to call this person white because the white number is higher. And partial allocation would say, no, we have more information than that. Let's use it. So let's treat it as a 0.35 in the American Indian category and 0.65 in the white category and treat it like a weight. That's partial allocation. So back when I was a postdoc in 2002 to 2005, postdoc at IPUMS USA, I worked on making the RACHSING variable and the PROB variables. And in these variables, I applied these NCHS equations to the IPUMS USA data. RACHSING is whole allocation, and the prob variables are partial allocation, and they align. Those are a set of variables. And I published about this in a 2008 demography paper with Andy Helper Manners. And these variables were continued up until 2014. There were some issues with RACHSING, however. RACHSING was entirely based on the original publication by the NCHS researchers. So that was based on the 1997 to 2000 data. And that data was getting pretty old. RACHSING stopped in 2014, but the need remained, and like, for example, the National Cancer Institute was using RACHSING to calculate their denominators for their cancer rates. And actually, that's where the funding for the new variables came in. The National Cancer Institute reached out to IPUMS to see if we could get this going again. And IPUMS reached out to me. And so the National Cancer Institute funded the development of this new variable that we're releasing right now. Another issue with RACHSING is that it did not deal with the non-Hispanic some other race cases. They're a pretty small proportion of cases, but those categories were not allocated. And finally, RACHSING did not match state data because a lot of state data includes Hispanic as a category parallel to races. And so the National Cancer Institute specifically needed these 5 groups: non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic Black, non-Hispanic American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian and Pacific Islander combined, non-Hispanic, and then Hispanic. And those 5 groups are consistent with how race groups were defined back in the first federal definition, and really, as a sociologist, pretty consistent with how a lot of Americans think of race actually working. So the RACHSING categories match those 5. You can see that RACHSING has an H in it because we've got Hispanic as one of the categories, Hispanic or Latino. And then RACHSING is a whole allocation version, and then the PRED variables are based on the prediction equation, and they're the same information, but they're partial allocation, same general information. So now I want to just briefly walk you through the steps I took to make RACHSING so you understand more where it's coming from. So in the Federal Statistical Research Data Center, I used restricted use data on multiple race people in the National Health Interview Survey. The restricted use version of the data allow location-based variables, and the prediction equations require location-based variables. So that's why I needed to go into the RDC. And I think that's why no one has updated the NCHS equations, even though it's been a very long time. So I used the 4-year pooled samples for every 4-year period between 1997 and 2018. And I created prediction equations separately for each of these samples. Another step that I had to do in there was to compress that huge number of multiple race categories into a small number of multiple race categories. I did this in the same way as the NCHS team, taking all people who report Hispanic and putting them in the Hispanic category, taking all Asian and all Pacific Islanders and putting together into an Asian and Pacific Islander category. And to deal with the extra category called some other race that the Census Bureau is allowed to use, but is not a federally defined category. If they reported a federally defined race and some other race, then some other race was just dropped. So if they said Black and some other race, then they're just in the Black category. If they reported no other race and no Hispanic origin, then I needed to allocate them, and I did that at the very end. I'll talk about that later. But once I do these kinds of simplification, you end up with only 11 multiple race groups, and they're all federally defined, all combinations of the federally defined groups. And this allows separate prediction equations. There were enough case counts to do separate equations for most of these groups, although not all. So separate prediction equations using the different sets of years and using the different multiple race groups and using individual and county level characteristics for each individual. So that created a huge set of prediction equation results, and those are going to be released in an MPC Minnesota Population Center working paper. I'll be releasing that in the next month or so. And these prediction equation results are available on request. If you would like them, then you can let IPUMS know and I'll send them along to you. So the next step was to apply these prediction equations to the public data that IPUMS disseminates. So this is the decennial censuses of 2000 and 2010 and the American Community Survey data from 2000 to 2019. So the steps involved there were to compress those multiple race answers into those same 11 groups using that same strategy. The prediction equations require context information. So I created PUMA level measures instead of county level measures, because PUMA is the lowest, most detailed geography that we have in these data sets. And then apply these newly developed prediction equations to the multiple race folks. And the result of applying the prediction equations, that is what the PRED variables are. So we've got the PRED variables, and they are fractions between 0 and 1, or decimals, I guess. And then the individual has a value. The highest PRED variable value becomes the information that I use to do whole allocation to create the RACHSING variable. And then there's all the other people in the data, and they also have values on RACHSING and the PRED variables. So everyone who was Hispanic, it's coded that way. Everyone who's a non-Hispanic single race person is coded as they just have a value of 1 on the PRED variables. And then the non-Hispanic some other race people, they received as an allocation, the average PRED variable value for their age group, state, foreign born status. That's it. Average of the non-Hispanic PRED variables. A little bit complex, but anyway, they have non-zero values on the PRED variables, and then they were whole allocated to the most common, the highest value PRED. So again, here are the categories. And here's just showing you some examples. Maybe this will help bring it home. So if a person reported Black for their race, they answered, no, I'm not Hispanic, then their value of RACHSING is just coded as non-Hispanic Black. I just coded that. They weren't involved in these variables in the prediction equations. And their value on PRED Black is a 1. And you can see that the sum of all the PRED variables is 1. Another person would say white and some other race. Hispanic is Cuban. Then their value on RACHSING just goes to Hispanic. If you want to know which Hispanic group, you got to go to the Hispan variable. It's right there. Their value on PRED HISP is 1. And again, the sum of those is exactly 1. Someone who said Chinese and white. Now this is where the prediction equations come in. So the prediction equations based on their age group, sex, and other things, personal and locational characteristics, it's predicted that they would go, the result of the prediction equation is that they would be 0.6327, that they would say they're Asian or Pacific Islander race. And if you want to know which race, which Asian and Pacific Islander race they said, you'd have to go back to the race detail. So that means that they're assigned in RACHSING to the Asian Pacific Islander group. Here's another example with the same, essentially the same story. They've got, you notice that the PRED variables can be pretty even. And that means that the PRED variables are giving you a significant amount of information, I think. I prefer using the PRED variables because these people said that they were multiple races, and the PRED variables actually keep that information. Someone who said some other race and not Hispanic would, this is what it might look like. So you could have a diversity of values on the PRED variables. They're always going to have a 0 on the PRED HISP because they said they were not Hispanic. And then they would be assigned to the RACHSING category with the highest PRED value. Okay, just to show you how this works, to round it out, you saw this chart already. This was the first of the examples of what's difficult to see. If you're using the race and the Hispanic variables. So here's what that same statistic would look like if you used RACHSING instead. Yeah, I like it. It's much cleaner, and each category is interpretable. If you were to use the PRED variables to calculate the same information, you get a slightly different percentage because we're using fractions, adding up fractions instead of adding up whole numbers. But you might consider this to be more accurate because those fractions are representing real uncertainty. We're not sure exactly which single race a multiple race person would choose. We're just predicting it. So I will turn it back over to Megan.
Thank you, Carolyn. All right, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, so now that you know more about the background and methodology for the RACHSING and predicted value variables, I want to show you where you can find these variables on the IPUMS USA website. So checking in that you can see the IPUMS USA webpage.
Correct, thanks.
Thank you. So this is the IPUMS USA landing page. And from here, I'm going to click on Get Data. And that's going to bring me to the custom data extract system. And I'm going to hover over the person menu bar because RACHSING is a person level variable. And I'm going to move down to race, ethnicity, and nativity. I'm going to click on that. That's going to bring me to all of the variables that fall under this category. So you can see race and Hispan are at the top here. And if I scroll down about halfway, I will see RACHSING right here. And if I click on RACHSING, I can read a little bit more about it. So if there's something you missed, you can check out the description here. So we've got description. I can move over to the codes tab. That's going to show me the codes and labels for the RACHSING variable. I can also toggle over to case count view, and that's going to give me the frequencies for each code within each sample. And so each of these tabs are going to have information about this variable. If I go back to the race, ethnicity, and nativity category of variables and scroll back down, you'll see that the PRED variables are right underneath RACHSING. And so I can click on these as well and read more about them. So that is how you find the variables on the IPUMS USA website. And let me switch over here. All right. So the final thing that we wanted to share with you before we conclude today is what samples RACHSING and the predicted value variables are available for. So right now, RACHSING and the PRED variables are available for the 2000 and 2010 decennial census samples and the 2000 through 2019 ACS samples. And the IPUMS USA team is currently working on integrating these variables backwards in time for the 1990 and prior samples so that these variables are available with a consistent coding scheme across the USA data collection. So this work is ongoing, and we hope to make this available on the website soon. So I also want to acknowledge all who made the availability of these variables possible, starting with the funding for Carolyn and the IPUMS staff, which came from the National Cancer Institute and the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute for Child Health and Human Development. I want to give a special thank you to the IPUMS staff on our cross-project team, Danica Brockman and Stephanie Richards, who processed these variables through the IPUMS system and up onto the IPUMS website. And finally, I want to thank Carolyn, who did a significant amount of work to create these variables and who continues to offer support and guidance on expanding these variables across the USA data collection. So thank you, Carolyn, for your contributions to this project.